We might kick off now. So welcome everybody to our GSQ and University of Queensland joint webinar. This week we have a panel of really clever experts who are going to show us through the world of isotopes and particularly how metal isotopes can help in mineral exploration, which is something that I think is going to be really interesting to learn about, particularly in perhaps areas where signatures for mineralization and normal vectoring tools are too subtle or don't necessarily work. So I know that we're going to see some great examples of how to use isotopes in those situations. Today we've got Ryan Mathur from Juniata College in the US, who's staying up very late to join us. We've also got Bruce Schaefer from Macquarie University down in Sydney, Brandon Mann from James Cook University up in Townsville, and we will also be joined by Dave Houston a little later in the afternoon. Next week's webinar, I'll just give a shout out for that, will be on geophysics in exploration, and we'll have a great panel of geophysicists for that session, so please join us next Thursday afternoon. For today's webinar, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will try and take questions at the end of each presentation. If not, the speakers will answer the questions during the next talk. You can also use the chat function, however it is better to put your questions in the Q&A tab. And we will also have a virtual drink session after the webinar, so please stick around for that. That's been going quite well in our previous sessions, and we'll change the setup so that everybody is visible and can talk to each other. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Ryan to take us through an introduction to how metal isotopes might be applied in mineral exploration, and then also talk us through some of the work that he and the guys from JCU have been doing at Mount Isa. Thanks, Ryan.
Okay, so here I'll get the screen share going. So thanks for inviting me to talk today. And I've designed this talk in a very general way, where I'm going to talk about a variety of different isotope systems and explain how more or less the isotopes can be used to identify hidden ore bodies. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on exactly why the isotopes fractionate and what happens to cause the different signatures that we see, but I'm going to talk in general about how it sort of works and how it can be used in an exploration sense, and how they can be used. So there's a variety of different aspects, and I start the first slide off with the fact that this is sort of like a greatest hits, we can think of it that way, where I talk about how I think are the most applied ways of using these different isotope systems. And it usually starts with some amount of field work and then a lot of different chemistry in the lab. So I'm going to talk sort of, there's a lot of different components that I won't talk about. Brandon will pick up a lot of the lab stuff, which I'm not going to discuss at all. Okay, so from a strategic standpoint, what kind of materials can we use to vector to find ores in using different metal isotopes? And so we have a variety of different materials that are matrices that we can consider. The first that I'll focus a lot of time on is water, and you can envision water as a probe which interacts with things in the subsurface and can pick up unique isotopic signatures to tell us what's in the subsurface. So I think that's a very good thing to use. And then analogous to that would be things sampling the water. So those would be plants, and so I'll give you an example of in some pretty dry areas what we see with different plants and how we can use those to vector to different ores. And then of course there's minerals, and so we can use ores, and obviously if you're in ore deposits you can get ores, and that's easy. And when you're looking for them, and they're obviously not that easy to find. So I'll also talk about iron oxides and other related sulfides like pyrite, and use those signatures in order to figure out where the deposits could be. And then finally I'll talk a bit about tin and rocks and how we can use that. So I'll focus in on these four today because I only have 40 minutes, and I'm going to try to adhere to that. And then I will not talk too much about soils and gravels, but they have been used in the past and with some success. So which elements are we going to use here? You can see here I have the periodic table, and I list the ones that I'll talk about today in blue here. I'll spend time talking about a lot of time with copper and a little bit with zinc and then show you some new data associated with silver isotopes, and then also some things that we've seen with antimony and tin. This is clearly not all of the ones that have been used in ore deposits. So there has been titanium, vanadium, chromium, molybdenum, iron, nickel, cadmium, tellurium, along with some others that have been used, which I will not discuss today, but have been used in ore deposits, not necessarily to vector just yet, but that have been used for us to understand what's going on. Okay, so all the data that you're going to see today are going to be presented to you in a per mil unit, and these are stable isotopes. And what's unique about doing this analysis is the fact that these are very small deviations that you're going to see. Unlike oxygen and carbon and hydrogen, you can have tens of per mil, even hundreds of per mil fractionation. Here, most of the units are going to be within about 1 to 2, maybe up to 5 per mil variation. Copper is the biggest one, so I use that as an example here. All the data will be presented to you in comparison to a international isotope standard. And I give you the example of copper here. And so the values, usually the heavier isotopes put on top. And so all these positive values means that there's an enrichment in the heavier isotope, and the negative values mean that there are enrichment in the lighter isotope. So I'll use the terms heavy and light, and that means heavy means higher values or greater than 0, and light means less than 0. And the equation here, as you can see, we're looking at deviations in the 3rd decimal place. And I have some instrumentation issues with mass bias that we can correct the values in a variety of ways, because the mass spectrometer induces its own business sometimes, so we got to correct for that. And most of the errors on the order of about 0.1 per mil. And you'll see they'll change for different isotope systems, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But think around 0.1 per mil or less, and that's about the error that you're going to see a lot on these data. Okay, so like I promised, the first thing we'll talk about is water. And so we're going to look at the reaction and try to trace the reaction when water interacts with the copper mineral. And so we're going to use the copper isotope signatures in waters to trace this mineral weathering. And I want to make it very clear that this unique signature that's found in waters that traces copper, that traces the weathering of copper sulfides, simply speaks to the ability to say that a copper sulfide is weathering. Not necessarily it's a giant ore deposit or a small ore deposit or whatever. It's an indicator, and that's the way you have to see it. It's not necessarily an end-all be-all. And so I just want to put that caveat in here. Now, what's important with the copper isotopes is that when copper minerals are weathered, they normally oxidize, and the oxidation reaction favors the heavier isotope in the reaction. So what'll happen is that if you have a solution that interacts with the copper sulfide, and it doesn't matter what the copper sulfide is, it could be chalcopyrite or bornite or chalcocite or tetrahedrite, and it doesn't matter how it was formed, the heavier isotope will be favored in the solution. And so what you're going to be looking for, and what you're going to see in the upcoming slides here, is that when we find areas where there are heavier or more enriched waters, that indicates the presence of weathering copper in the subsurface. Copper minerals in the subsurface. And so understanding the hydrogeology is also very important, and how the water is moving and what's causing it to dissolve ultimately. All right, so the example here, the first one that we had published is the Pebble deposit in Alaska, and it's a large copper, molybdenum, gold deposit. And it's not being mined currently. It sits in the tundra. I have a location map here, and you can see where the Pebble mine sits. And this started with Leanne Monk in the University of Alaska, and she contacted me in 2008, and I had written some papers where I predicted, we thought that the weathering of copper sulfides would lead to heavier waters. And it's not exactly easy to get waters in active mining areas or in exploration. So when she contacted me, it said, of course, let's try it. And so the first experiment here, you can see Pebble in the center here. The black outline is the 0.5% copper line. So inside that boundary is the mine, or not the mine, the deposit itself. And the little dash line there represents the fault that transects the deposit. And so you can see that we have a variety of samples that when we were able to collect on the deposit, and then a variety of samples that are off the deposit, and you can see where they're located. And for the first study here are labeled, the waters that we were looking at are seeps. And this is what a seep looks like. If you don't know, I call them springs. There they call them seeps. And looking for an ore deposit here is not simple. You can see it's a tundra, and you have to use a variety of ways to sort of identify the ore in the subsurface. And so we went around and sampled these seeps, and we predicted, or we thought that we would be able to find a heavier copper isotope value where the copper sulfide was weathering. And I simply like this image. So every time I talk about Pebble, I show this image because it's quite beautiful. And the area was quite a nice place to see. And if you haven't seen it, I figured it's a good time to have a look. So the results are, if you look right on the deposit where that red square is here, you can see that the copper isotope values that cluster in the seeps there have an average copper isotope value of plus 1.4 per mil. And if you go off the deposit, the values there are about minus 0.27 per mil. So you can see there's an obvious difference when we just average the data on and off the deposit. And so we would indicate here, even though this is a rather complicated hydrogeological territory because we have till here that water is going through, and the deposit actually sits in some instances greater than 1 kilometer in the subsurface, we still see this copper, high copper isotope values right on top of the deposit, which we interpret as weathering. So the question is how robust is this, and why would you do this sort of analysis? And here I have a concentration plot versus the copper isotope value that we see. And so, I put the average crustal value, the average river value is around 0.5, just to give you an idea. I didn't mark it on this graphic, but that's approximately what it is per mil. But what's important here is that when you look at this samples on the deposit and off the deposit, there's a variety of samples. If you look on the right side of this diagram, which I just highlighted right here, that show at very low concentration, you can see at around less than 10 ppb, we have values on the deposit itself that have a value greater than 2, 1.5 or 2. And so why you would want to do this sort of analysis is because the majority of the waters that you're going to look at are going to be at relatively low concentration copper. Now, it's no brainer that these higher concentration stuff have higher copper isotope ratios, and there could be some mixing that make this. But the point is that the isotopes give you a different layer and something more than simply looking at concentration. And so that's the reason why you want to do something like this. And you can see that there's a clear difference on and off, at least in this instance. And so then we looked at different times because we wondered, is the signal going to change if you sample at different time periods? And so here I've got the same sample locations sampled at 2 different time points, one in 2010 and the other in 2009. And the line in there is 1 to 1. So you can see the line roughly fits. And so the copper isotope value does have some variability, but remains relatively the same and over different times. And so this was sampled, and to give you an idea of timing, in 2009, I think it was in July, and in 2010, it was in August. So, but the water was flowing at these times because, you know, it's a cold spot and it's not always flowing. So then we expanded this to look at different types of waters, because the question then is, because we simply looking at seeps, we also can look at streams and lakes. And so we did the same sort of activity. And here, as I said before, on this diagram is a relatively simple diagram where on the Y I have the copper isotope value, and then I'm just comparing on the X the different types of water. And so the first that you can see here on the left is, here's the seeps on and seeps off. And so this is the natural 1 sigma variation. And then you can see the ponds on and off also show differences. Groundwater also shows differences, which is interesting because groundwater is sort of starved of electrons, but we still see that when the oxidation reactions, it still has a higher isotope signature. And then you can see if you compare all the values on and off, there's still a distinct difference, with the values on the deposit being much higher than that off the deposit. So that showed that multiple different types of waters, as long as you compare the same type, you're going to get, you can see some differences. And so then this got people really excited in 2011, and so then in 2012 we continued to do exploration in the area, and we targeted areas based on the geophysics of the area, because there are some anomalies there that speak to other porphyries that are of the same age, most likely. And so then we basically did detailed sampling, and this is all pond data that you're looking at right here. And there are 3 areas that we looked at. One, right on the shore of Iliamna, you can see where those little lights up with some higher values there. And then then right to the south of Pebble, there was another large known area. And then sort of to the northeast, and there's known to be an epithermal gold deposit. So we just took some samples over there, and then also to the west. So those were the general areas that we targeted. And if you look at the clustering, we did an analysis, a cluster analysis, and some contouring. But the cluster right beneath Pebble, which has all those green dots, showed the greatest potential. And so then in 2012, things were drilled and they did find things. But then the price of gold pooped out, and so the study ended at that point. And this is sort of where we're left. But it gives you some direction and some ideas of things that can be done and have been done. So we also, we're currently working on a project in Mount Isa. And so here's a geological map of Mount Isa with groundwater sampling that we had in the, along with some other types of water that we had sampled just basically once in February, March, and then I think in April when these samples were collected this year. And so we did the same experiment where we looked close to the deposit. And then, and so what I got here are values that are relatively close to the deposit, also close to where tailings are, because as I say here, and you can see that there's relatively high values. When you look at there's two outliers that we didn't plot here. We're still working with the data. And then if we look south of the deposit and right on the border of the deposit, we get much lower values. So it appears that this is also true in Mount Isa, that where we weather these things, you get higher copper isotope values right on the deposit or very proximal to the deposit in comparison to farther away from the deposit, and it's relatively distinct. And so that's quite encouraging, and drives home the point that it really doesn't matter the type of deposit, it's just simply the weathering of the copper mineral of interest. Now, I didn't spend too much time talking about the exact type of minerals that are being weathered, but we've done a variety of studies here. And we know that when you weather chalcopyrite, it produces a solution that's about 1.5 per mil greater than the starting material. In contrast to that, if you weather chalcocite, the solution gets about 3 per mil heavier, or twice that in what's in chalcopyrite. And so what's interesting about this is if you have an understanding of what the starting copper isotope composition is of the ore that you're looking at, or maybe that you're searching for or targeting, you can come up with maybe you might be able to hypothesize what copper minerals being weathered by looking at the copper isotope signature in the water. And so here I've got a contrast of the liquid minus the solid, and the solid in this instance is the starting copper sulfide that we measured in these deposits. It's a mean value, and then also the liquid is a mean value taken on top of each of these deposits. So you can see there's a variety of deposits here that are weathering chalcopyrite. Xikuangshan is a skarn deposit in China, and then Prospect Gulch is an epithermal system in Colorado. Pebble I just talked about, and then you can see that since we know what the starting chalcopyrites are there in the waters, that yellow sort of bar indicates where you'd predict delta value for the weathering of chalcopyrite. And then in contrast, if you look at deposits that are weathering chalcocite, and so Silver Bell, which is a porphyry in Arizona, Butte, a porphyry in Montana, Las Cruces, a massive sulfide in Spain, and Inca de Oro, which is a variety of things in Chile, you can see that the delta values overlap quite nicely when you know you're weathering chalcocite to what the values are that you're getting there. So not only can you see the presence of the sulfide, but you may actually indeed be able to indicate what sulfide is weathering. And what's interesting also here is a study we did with First Quantum, and this is a rather busy diagram. It plots different types of things where we've sampled wells and then also rocks. And so the rocks, meaning minerals in this instance, are chalcopyrite that we sampled in the ore deposit. And you can see that those copper isotope values, there's a gradient that is shown in the chalcopyrite, which is interesting in and of itself on the fold. But you can also see that the water responds to the gray areas of the gray, I should say, dots of the water correlate with the gray ores. And then as the ore gets heavier, so does the water. And so it seems to be a pretty sensitive indicator. I mean, and so that if you're seeing the signature, you're probably really close to where the weathering is of the sulfide. All right, so we move on to plants. Here I've got some examples of how we use copper in mesquites. And so what we did in southern Arizona here, they were prospecting in about, I don't know, it was 2009 or 8 or so. Milrock was doing this, and so we looked at mesquites of ages 3 to 5, and we took off branches and processed about the same amount of mesquite. And then we wondered if we could pick up a trace of heavy copper in mesquite that might correlate with the weathering or a source of chalcopyrite at depth, or chalcocite. Chalcocite was instance here. So in order for that to happen, generally speaking, you have to have the water sort of match what's happening with the mesquite. So we had 4 sampling points here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sorry, and where we had the copper isotope value where we collected water right beside where the plant was. And so you can see there's a positive correlation there. So that's kind of a good indicator. So if you have heavy water, you'll actually see it in the mesquite itself. And so that was sort of a first level observation that we made. Obviously more there would be good. And so we proceeded on and looked at a variety of areas. And I just show you a detailed contour map here with both concentration and isotope values in here. And I just center your attention to where the higher values are in the green in this contour map that I plotted here is where the highest copper isotope values were found in the mesquites. And they actually did find chalcocite on surface and had some other good indicators in this area that they were exploring. And right on the border between Arizona and New Mexico, you can kind of see that borderline popping up on the map right here. So it does appear that plants also have the potential. I mean, I'm just showing you mesquites here, but we've looked at other species also. Okay, so that goes through water and plants, and then now what are we going to do about and talk about minerals? And so here I've got I'll talk about briefly weathered remnants of sulfides by looking at leach caps, and so that's what you're seeing on your left here. A leach cap here in silver bell, and looking at the iron oxides is presence of copper mineral weathering. And then I have some drill core on the right for pyrite, because we can run it, we intersect pyrite a lot, and can we use the copper isotope signature in the pyrite as an indicator or vector to where ores may be. Okay, so this is a work that we did with Anglo and Dave Braxton in Quellaveco in Peru. We did a lot of study there trying to understand if we can use the copper isotope composition in the iron oxides to indicate weathering of previous enrichment blankets. And so the hypothesis here is that the iron oxides that would be residual from the chalcocite weathering would be slightly heavier than those not associated with weathering of chalcocite. And so on this map here, we have on your left shows supergene thicknesses and where high copper concentrations are. And then on the right are copper isotope values that are from the iron oxides there. And you can see that there's a pretty good correlation between higher or heavier copper isotope values and also greater supergene thicknesses. And so there seems to be, if you find heavier copper isotope signatures in iron oxides in an area, it does correlate with the presence of supergene chalcocite at depth. So it's an idea. One way of saying it is you're sort of tracking the cycling of the copper in the Earth's crust by looking at the iron oxides. And so that gives you an indicator there for what might be happening at depth. Profile more or less says the same sort of thing when we're talking about trying to identify enrichment at depth. Another possible vector using minerals, so that's iron oxides. And so we'll skip over here to pyrites in layered mafic intrusions. Yun Zhao and I had done some work on some mafic intrusions, layered mafic intrusions in China. And we did find a vectorable pattern within both the chalcopyrite and the pyrite using iron and copper. So that's kind of interesting, and just to sort of give you an idea of the vector. And here the vectors more proximal to the ore were light, and then as you get farther and farther away, the values sort of increase. And that's sort of what this is showing in a very sort of complicated way. And then we also did some work looking at pyrites in the Desheng area in China, where there's a variety of ore deposits present. And so what we did is we looked at pyrite taken from sericitic alteration associated with Desheng, which is a porphyry copper, and then also several gold deposits that may or may not be related. And so that's Yinshan, as you can see, off to the south, and Jinshan east, I should say, excuse me, southwest, and then Jinshan, which is just directly south of the deposit ore cluster. And what's interesting here is that you can actually see copper isotope variations on the order of several per mil within the pyrite in the porphyry, but are relatively tightly clustered in the gold deposits. And so there might be some indicator not only of, because there's variation here, we don't have a lot of samples to vector here, but what this shows is that there is enough isotopic variation both in iron and copper in these things, which would lead them or maybe make them perhaps ability to vector with. And people have done, this is just work that I've done that I'm showing, but there are several other articles that people have looked at iron specifically in pyrite and gold deposits and have seen similar types of results with large variation and large potential to vector to source. And so another sort of vectoring tool here is I've got a way of mapping it out here in cross section with porphyries, because there's a lot that we've looked at here. And in porphyries, if you looked on the left here, usually closer to the core of these porphyry coppers, you find lighter values. And then as you get farther away, things become higher. And that's also the case I'll show you for antimony and stibnite, and also might copper and silver and native gold is sort of another story, but that also might be used for vectoring. And then in contrast, if you look over to your right, see that was left, and if you look to your right, you'll see skarns. And skarns show an inverse pattern where heavier values are closer in the source, and then as you get lighter, as you get farther away, you get lighter values. And that's probably related to the CO2 in the system. All right. So we'll look at some of these ores and how you can vector with them and examples of them. Here's an example from Pebble. And so this is a cross section, more or less running, I would say, northeast to southwest of the previous maps that I'd shown you. And what we did is we contoured the copper isotope values here. And what you can see at the base of the porphyry, you get relatively the cool colors or lighter values. And then as you get into higher parts of the system, you get higher values. And so, you know, if you're looking for one of these things and you have some chalcopyrite in the core, obviously alteration tells you things, but you might be able to use the chalcopyrite to also vector into where the source might be. Okay. And here's those fluid flow diagrams to give you an idea about how to vector. Same work was done by one of our graduate students, Molly Dendas. She did the same thing in Bingham. And so here, she changed the color scheme on me, but in the center where it's red or where the low copper isotope values are, this is a cross section. And then in the green, you know, that goes up to about 1 per mil, and then the blue on the top and the propylitic there goes to about 1.5 to 2 per mil. And you see the same sort of pattern going from light to heavy at Bingham. Interestingly enough, if you do it in Mount Isa, and look at the chalcopyrites there, we see a similar type of relationship where lighter values are found in the core of the ore body and heavier values are found on the extremities or the outer parts of the ore body. And that's what this sort of diagram indicates, and can give you some ideas that can also be used to vector in not only high temperature systems, but even lower temperature systems like here in Mount Isa. The zinc is complicated, to say the least. We did look at some zinc isotopes in the sphalerite in Mount Isa, and there's probably a story there that'll tell us something about the genesis of these of the ore deposit, but there's not a clear vector, at least not one that we can identify yet with our sampling. But it's some quite interesting data. There's variation and I think some things that are going to be interesting there ultimately to talk about. Another deposit we've been working on, just to give you an idea of vectoring, it can also be done with antimony. Even this is a very heavy isotope. You're at about 120 here, 123. And it shows a similar type of pattern where this is from Xikuangshan. I think I said it right. I hope I did. And it's the largest antimony deposit. It's one of the most largest. It's the largest resource that we have of antimony on Earth, and it's a metamorphic deposit. And so what we did is we sampled along the major structures there, and we found that as you can see, the sampling and also the cross sections here, as you're closer to the source, you get lighter values, and then as you go farther away, you get heavier values. And the unit here changed to epsilon. It's not, that's 10,000 rather than 1,000. That's why those values are a little bit higher on the figure labeled B here. But the point is that, once again, you see vectoring ability with antimony isotopes. And so the last idea I wanted to leave with and give you some ideas of the things we've been working on is how we can use copper and silver in native gold, and what can they what does it mean, and are there meanings for it? Because looking at the source of gold and also finding out patterning in gold, in native gold, is something that'd be fascinating. And because there are elevated concentrations of silver and gold, silver and copper and gold, we can use both of these isotope systems to have a look, and what that might be able to tell us about how these things formed, or potentially trace back to where the source of the gold may be. And so this is relatively new, and I'm showing you some work from Bingham in here et al. From 2019, where they're looking just at silver in different nuggets, and they can actually see slight variations within the silver isotope ratios in the nuggets, but there's measurable amounts. And what's interesting here is that if you look at different types of placers, and you can see, I've just done this. This is sort of a study that is in the beginning, where I'm starting to look at copper and silver in the placer and to see what the variations may tell us. And one thing I was interested in is that there's some golds that have very biological textures associated with them, and I circled them at the bottom here in Nevada, and also in Venezuela, and some of the Sonoran gold that we looked at here. And you can see that these ones that have arguably biogenic textures have relatively lower copper and silver isotope values, whereas if you look at more metamorphic and also epithermal type deposits, and they're very general. I know I have Australia. I've just gotten a variety of nuggets that I was able to purchase from there in a variety of places. It just gives you a sense of the spread. And the reason I'm showing you guys this is because I think this is something that would be fascinating to apply to one deposit or one placer and see what's going on. And then ultimately you could take things like this and compare them to older placers and try to understand process like the bits, is it a placer or not? And you can have a lot of interesting things that you could do with this data. And I'm just sort of showing it to you as a means to hopefully inspire or intrigue, so that we can so we can think of how this could be used, because there is isotopic variation that can be measured there, and it must mean something. And this is sort of the beginning of what we're thinking. And then the last thing I want to talk about is tin. And I know I've still got 6 minutes and no one sent me any nasty notes yet, so I'm still in good shape. And so we've done a lot of work with tin, and we're trying to figure out, we know that there's a lot of most likely redox reactions in when you have tin mineralization occur. And so most people think that tin comes out in most solutions in a reduced form. That's arguable too. Then you have as tin2, and then during its precipitation, you get an oxidation reaction, and it goes to 4 as you make a siderite. And so what we were doing here is we found some very interesting relationships with redox in different tin minerals. But what I thought was interesting is that if you look at the igneous rocks associated or thought to be associated with tin mineralization, they are all isotopically lighter than most known felsic and mafic rocks that have been reported in the literature. So we might be able to use actually tin isotope values in rocks as indicators of ore process. And so here I've just got a comparison of the rocks and the ores, and just to make the point that the ores sort of sit at higher values, which probably represent this oxidation reaction, and then the residual amount in the rocks have the lower isotope value. So there's probably some mass balance that exists there. And I think that's quite interesting. So that'd be an example of how you could use these metals in rocks to make some general relationships. All right, so to sort of sum up, what I think is interesting is if we could examine waters in unknown areas and more unknown areas to really hammer out this sulfide weathering story, I think that is a really great hope in exploration geochemistry, because we can get waters, and also in plants you could make it that. That's what the second topic is there. And then I didn't really talk about soils, and soils are interesting, especially when you're tracing exotic deposits and gravels. And I've only done maybe 2 or 3 studies there. I haven't seen too much there. And then and also looking in more SEDEX deposits. I gave you one example here, but it'd be nice to see more in an exploration sense. A lot of the current literature is not always focused on exploration, but there has been several articles there. But I think there's room to grow there for sure. Okay, and then with that, I thank you for your time and attention. I'd just like to acknowledge all these people who have funded all these things, and I really appreciate them doing so. And I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for joining us all the way from the US. And I know I got a lot out of that presentation. We do have a question here. So somebody is asking, does this include mobilization of deposits? And I think that question came up fairly early in your talk, so I'm not entirely sure what it's referring to now. It's in the first 5 minutes or so.
The first 5 minutes it came in. So let me go back to which slide. Wonder if I was talking about deposits. Was it with the waters?
I'm not entirely sure, but maybe that person will come back with another question. Would give us some more context. That'd be great.
Yeah.
And Ian Wolfe was drawing attention to some work on the interpretation of leached outcrops by Ronald.
Yeah, by Ronald Blanchard. Yeah, I have that book. It's quite nice.
Cool.
Yeah. Yes, it was
Bruce.
the water.
Yeah, Bruce says it was with the waters. Yep, the previous question.
Yeah. So the mobilization, I guess, when you think about it, the dispersion of the metal in solution, how far will you be able to see? If you look at a lot of the studies that we've done with just the deposit itself, usually within about 1 kilometer or 2 of the deposit is about the distance it'll disperse or mobilize. And then if you look at the flip side and the environmental side, where people have looked at like Butte and some other places where they've enhanced sulfide weathering, it can go up to several kilometers. I think if that's what you're getting at.
Okay, and then Uraj is asking, for skarns, heavier copper isotopes around the deposit related to CO2, any further ideas why that might be?
Yeah, that would be probably because when the fluid interacts, my guess is with the, and neutralizes with the limestone, you probably oxidize things immediately. I'm guessing that that's a quick oxidation reaction that's happening there, and that favors the heavy, and then that's sort of that's my suspicion. Makes
sense. And I'm curious why heavier copper isotopes tend to be released during sulfide weathering, as generally lighter isotopes tend to go into solutions preferentially or enter reactions. Yeah, and that would be it's a bond strength thing, and so when you look at the oxidized copper bonds, it's a strength and length thing, and so that's the easiest way to put it. And there's been a lot of experimental calculations to show that. It's just not me randomly thinking this. I didn't go into any of those papers. That's why I said the why. I didn't talk too much about it, but yeah, just think about it. There's a lot of bond studies that more or less that answer that question. Right. Okay. And now I have a question. In Australia, as you would know, Ryan, we have a lot of deposits that are undercover, and that's one of the big problems facing explorers now. We're always looking for tools to be able to see through that cover. And so given the propensity for groundwater circulation to be moving through perhaps overlying cover sequences, and we're talking maybe a few 100 meters depth as a realistic option for looking for mineralization without going too deep. Do you think that we could, do you think that looking for, say, copper mineralization in the northwest under 100 meters of cover, that we could use copper isotopes to? Yeah. So I think like the example there, the first one I started with Pebble. Yeah. Like Pebble, think about that. If you looked at those cross sections, you're at least several 100 meters under, right? Now the question is where's the copper being picked up? Is it in the till or is it actually interacting with the bedrock? And in that instance, we've actually looked at really deep wells. And so some of that groundwater stuff that I just showed quickly there, you can see a big difference of the groundwater at depth on the deposit in comparison to deeper wells off the deposit. So I would think yes. Okay, and so you would look at the water rather than the overlying sediments to try and pick that up.
And I think if you have leached iron oxides too, they also might help. If you have drill core with those usually get overlooked and not considered. Might be something worth thinking about.
Okay.
I had a question if we had time.
Yep, we do.
When I was looking at the results you showed for Mount Isa in the surface samples, it looked like if I read them correctly, it looked like the results were quite asymmetric. That there was a big difference between the results to the north of the deposit as opposed to the south of the deposit, rather than a symmetrical relationship with proximity, which is interesting because the deposit itself is very asymmetric. So I'd just be interested to hear more comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's also a sampling thing because there's a big gap on the in-between where the waters were had. So we were really controlled with where we could actually get water. And so I think the sampling is going to really control that because, I agree that's sort of the center, basically where Mount Isa is located, and south of that, we don't have many points. And that's just on the basis of what we're able to sample, I think. And so that might be contributing to the asymmetry appearance. But yeah, I think, I think the total of samples number there are only around 20, 21, something like that. So I think we're kind of limited there. But yeah, there would be, I think also the symmetry up to the north, there's a bunch of tailings that sit to the north, I get this right. Yeah, northwest of the deposit, right? And so there's this cluster of higher values that seem to like move over to the west. And I have a suspicion we're tracking tailings copper, which may be good or bad. I don't know who you are when you see things like that, but that's what the data would argue.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine too many sort of pristine sampling opportunities in that area.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Ryan. You can stick around and join us afterwards, or I know that it's pretty late there, so we'll let you go and forgive you if you disappear.